Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Josh Schimmels, publisher and CEO of the Los Angeles Business Journal. It's an honor to be here moderating today's conversation on the tariff effect, where we're going to talk about impact and strategies. We all continue to read a lot about global trade. As dynamics shift and new tariffs come into play, businesses here in Los Angeles and across the country are being challenged to rethink things like how they operate, how they plan, and how they really compete in the new market and the new conditions. The ability to adapt to these changes is becoming critical for long-term resilience. Today's discussion is going to explore how tariffs are impacting businesses across different industries and the strategies that companies can use to mitigate risk, to manage costs, and to navigate an evolving global marketplace. I'm joined today by two leading experts who bring deep knowledge of transfer pricing, trade advisory services, and global strategy. We're fortunate to have them here to help unpack the key challenges and potential opportunities ahead. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to cover topics such as the true cost of tariffs, financial strategies, trade compliance, and new opportunities in global pricing and sourcing. All right, before we get started, I'd like to say a special thank you to our partners for coming together to make this conversation possible. A lot of planning goes into this, and we deeply appreciate all that they've done to support it. So first off, thank you to RSM, and many thanks to Witham. All right, we've got a lot of great content to get to, so let's dive in. I'd like to welcome today's experts. Marina Gentili, partner at Witham, Global Transfer Pricing Strategies, and leader at HLB, International Transfer Pricing, and also Mark Ludwig, National Leader of Trade and Tariff Advisory Services at RSM. Marina, Ludwig, welcome. How are you today?
Doing great.
Wonderful.
Happy to be here.
All right. It's a pleasure to have you both. I think this conversation couldn't come at a better time. The impact of tariffs is something that is going to touch and is already starting to touch nearly every industry in business. And it's something that is only going to increase in its effect. Let's kick off the discussion talking and looking really at the big picture, but on a more localized level. So my question to each of you is, how are tariffs reshaping the way businesses in Los Angeles are thinking about global trade and then local resilience? Marina, let's start with you.
Yeah, great question. I mean, at this point, all companies are impacted by tariffs, right? It's not a new concept, but this level of sort of, kind of aggressive and consistent around the world tariffs is fairly new to people that haven't had to deal with it before. I think companies are needing to be very well versed in their supply chains, right? Really understanding their bargaining power or negotiation ability in those supply chains, right? Vendor, customer, and the importer of record or distributor, typically the distributor in the middle, and sort of what they can do to mitigate some of these, the tariff impact. It's a little bit of a different world. A lot of the, sort of de minimis products and exemptions and rebates are no longer available. So, but as we were talking earlier, this is playing out day by day. So this content is accurate as of this minute, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. It seems like every day, in some case every hour, there's something new to respond and react to. Mark, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, work with a lot of companies, including those in the greater Los Angeles area, but also really globally, not just nationwide, but globally, that are all struggling with, one, understanding the impact because of how rapid the deployment of these tariffs and how extreme, perhaps is the right word, the jump from a normal tariff rate, which in the US has averaged less than 2% for quite some time to suddenly to see double digits and in some cases triple digit percentages levied on goods that are imported across a broad swath, right? Everything from base materials all the way to much more advanced scientific instruments and equipment to consumer goods. A lot of companies have been caught flat-footed, I guess is the right word, unexpecting that the campaign promises would actually be played out with the severity and the intensity that they have been implemented. And also, I think companies are looking at commercial arrangements, doing what they can, and then realizing those aren't enough. It's not enough necessarily to go up to your foreign vendor, be they in China, be they in Australia, or any other location in the world that's being impacted by these new US tariffs, and saying, hey, can you lower your price a little bit to give us a helping hand here so we can maintain competitiveness? That's one tactic. However, there's so many more that could potentially be assessed and implemented. And I think companies are beyond the cursory, immediate, visceral gut reaction of, how are we going to do this? Are we just going to eat this as part of our reduced margin and try to keep ourselves competitive? Or are we going to pass these costs on to the downstream consumer? Or are we going to go ask our vendors to give us a break on the pricing? The reality is those are commercial decisions, but there's other aspects here. There are, what are the tariffs? What is inside the tariff? What are the executive orders really saying? What programs are still out there for us to potentially lever to reduce, mitigate, recover, or otherwise exempt ourselves from potentially paying these tariffs? And by the way, the newer tariffs that have been implemented since February are actually quite tight in terms of allowing companies to find avenues to pursue, because I think the administration learned from the first time around there was a lot of leakage in the first round of China tariffs in 2018 and a lot of exemptions and exclusions that were handed out. I think now that's been a lot more concentrated power in the executive branch to basically say nobody else is getting an exclusion and we're going to manage this. But doesn't mean they're still not planning opportunities. So I think that's the next conversation companies are starting to have. What are we paying in tariffs and what are we going to be paying, and how do we best manage this beyond just seeking price concessions?
Mark, thank you so much. And we're going to get into more detail in some of the topics that you just mentioned. Sticking with you, Mark, one of the questions that we get often from companies is, we hear single digit, double digit, triple digit percentage on tariffs. What does this actually mean? How can a company actually calculate the true cost of tariffs?
Yeah. Well, all the new tariffs that have been implemented are ad valorem tariffs, which basically is Latin for, adding value, right? Added additional cost. So it's basically percentage. There are multiple types of tariffs. One is ad valorem. Another one is a specific rate tariff, which is perhaps 50 cents over every pound, or 8 cents over every diameter of a particular metal width of wire. So those are specific rates. There are ad valorem rates, which are the percentage over the landed value, your declared value. And then there is a compound tariff, which is a combination of a specific rate and an ad valorem rate. Those are rare, but what does it mean? So how do you calculate? Well, really, you start with, in the US, we're allowed to start using an FOB value, a free on board declared value, versus a CIF value, which is their cost, insurance, and freight value. Why are we allowed to do that? Well, it's written into the regulations of US Customs, but you have to have information about what your actual insurance charge, what your actual freight charge for that shipment, to be able to exclude those. They tend to actually equal to about 4 to 6% on an average shipment. So that's an immediate way to start potentially planning. But to the point of tariffs, how do you factor it? Well, it's pretty a straight line math. You take the value of your declared imported merchandise, you times that by the ad valorem rate that's applicable, and that determines what your tariff is. There's also some fees, customs charges, harbor maintenance fee, merchandise processing fees, smaller fees around less than 1%, but they can still add up. All those are multiple taxes really at the end of the day on top of your declared value. So your declared value is your foundation and perhaps as equally important as the actual tariff itself.
I appreciate that, Marina. So as we look at costs, how are they starting to show up in key industries like tech and manufacturing and logistics? And I guess the second part of that question, are there some sectors that are feeling the impact more than others today? Marina, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Services in general, as of this moment, are not, impacted, right? So the tech industry, typically SaaS products, things like that, isn't the hardest hit right now. However, there are tech companies that have, hardware that's coming over, and a lot of it from China with the high, tariff, et cetera. And also, just because the discussion isn't there now doesn't mean it's not going to happen. There's definitely, a sequence to this. So the biggest consideration is a physical good crossing a border into the US, right? So that's where we're focused. I think, at LA specific type stuff, Hollywood, right? Just the entertainment industry in general. Um, you know, with the tariffs on Canada, which was a free trade kind of space before, as you know, a lot of production happens, a lot of filming of TV shows and movies happen in Canada. And so that now there's discussion about, is there going to be some retaliation, and will there be less favorable incentives, right? Because the reason it happens is, the incentives that are out there related to that, right? And then there are some places like China and other markets that are trying to limit the viewing, right, of movies, of American movies, as they come in. So that could be another hit. So we could have some increased costs, decreased revenue to the studios for sure.
Yeah, I think that's something we're going to have to keep an eye on as it specifically impacts our region more than many others in the United States. I want to shift. We're talking about some of the issues and the problems, and we'll continue to dive into those. But it's so important for us to talk about solutions. Are there customs or trade programs that businesses can use to lower or possibly even eliminate some of the tariff costs? Mark, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, there's a plethora of them. Let's start with some of the older ones that have been on the books for a long time. One is a foreign trade zone. Those are basically akin to what we've heard over the years in other countries called free zones. In the US, a foreign trade zone basically offers a duty deferral, exemption, or reduction for goods that are coming into the country that are processed. So technically, a foreign trade zone sits territorially in the United States, but for customs purposes is outside the customs territory of the U.S. It's a little bit more specific than that, but those are the general jits. So you basically have a deferred tariff status while you're in the foreign trade zone. And then when you either re-export the goods, it's a complete exemption, or if you domestically import them, you can take advantage of a different rate if you've done some processing. There's some nuances to that. I won't necessarily have time to go into those. Another program in the United States is bonded warehouses and bonded transportation. That is seeing an explosion of interest right now. And there are a tremendous amount of resources in the bonding space, bonded warehouses, bonded carriers, et cetera, in and around the greater Los Angeles marketplace. It's one of the largest and most active ports in the United States, of course, the seaport and the airport. And as a result, there's a whole ecosystem that is built up around both transportation, logistics, and customs brokerage. But even therein, the specialty things such as bonded warehouses. Bonded warehouses are great because you can actually manipulate goods in them. You can manufacture and produce and get the tariff deferral and exemption if you re-export, but also you can store merchandise in there. So goods coming in at today 125+% tariff from China, if they're put in the bonded warehouse in the bonded status, and maybe 3 months from now, there's a deal struck between Xi Jinping and President Trump where tariffs start dropping. When you enter those goods into the U.S. commerce, you don't have to pay the tariff at the 125+%. Maybe the tariff at that time will be only 50%. So that is a tremendous program. So bonded warehouses, foreign trade zones are some of the most, I guess, more stable and beneficial programs. However, they do require assessments, cost benefit analyses, and a lead time to stand up because they require approval from U.S. Customs. So those are two. I think I'll stop there, give a break, and we can come back to that topic if there's more interest.
I'd love to add to that.
Yes, please.
Mark, that was really interesting, and a lot of what I'm talking to my clients about as well, and what I'm seeing them do. I spent a lot of time in sort of global tax and transfer pricing strategies, looking at the global structure and seeing if the supply chain can be tweaked a bit. A lot of what we see is companies establishing a North America presence in the US and then ongoing sales to customers in Canada, customers in Mexico, right? Other areas. So now the question becomes, why are we importing products into the US that aren't staying here to begin with? And do we establish, distribution entities in these other markets and, have a direct supply chain from the manufacturer into those markets? But you said it before, like there's a ripple effect, right? You need to look at all of it because the tax implications on all of this are there too. So you have to kind of run the scenarios.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's stay here, and I want to go back a little bit. In your opening responses, Mark, you mentioned, you talked about percentages, and we hear terms like landed value and landed costs. With tariffs now applied as a percentage of declared value, are there legitimate ways to reduce that value as a way to potentially lower the overall duty owed? What are your thoughts here? What are companies doing, or what can they do?
Yeah, great question. I'm getting this question multiple times a day from clients and prospects we're interacting with. Let's start at the early one that I talked about already, which was you have a choice of declaring goods at FOB or CIF value. Always choose FOB value if you can get your hands on the actual detail relief of your freight bills and your insurance charges for the goods that you're importing into the country. Because if you can do that, that immediately shaves a few percentage points off the landed declared value or price you declare to customs. Another one is under the regulations, U.S. Customs regulations, you are allowed to have certain non-dutiable charges that you don't have to include. So if you have an invoice from an overseas vendor that includes various charges and costs, and you haven't kind of gone in through it and figured out how can we break down a little bit more what's included in that price of the good that we're buying. If there's some intangibles, there's maybe some commissions, there's other types of what we call soft charges. They could be related to intellectual property. They could be related to packing. They could be related to coordination, engineering services, whatever, even software, for example. Those charges don't necessarily need to be included in the declared value upon which you pay tariffs. So there's a very tight reading and interpretation, of course, has to happen on a case-by-case basis. I don't want to be too universal about this, but that's another place to look, is completely break apart what is included in the price and see if there is legitimate legal opportunities to remove some of those charges. So you have what's known as a net entered value. You have a declared value on your invoices, and then you can have a net entered value, which doesn't necessarily need to be 100% of the same value that's on your invoice on your customs declaration form, because you don't submit your invoice to customs when you make a filing. You submit your customs declaration, which builds from other documents such as invoices, purchase orders, bills of lading, and things like that. So those are two important things. There's a third one I'll talk about quickly. It's called first sale for export. It's a 3-tiered transaction structure. If you have a foreign manufacturer, a middleman company, and the U.S. importer, under certain allowances and guidance issued by customs and prior rulings dating back even to the late 80s, early 90s, you can have a three-tier transaction and pay your customs value or pay your tariffs on the customs value of the sale from the foreign manufacturer to the middleman company rather than the middleman's markup to the US importer. So that requires some planning and structuring, but it works well with international tax planning. What you have to have transfer pricing involved if you have related party purchases, et cetera. But it is a very big one that, in addition to bonded warehouses, on the special program side, for sale for export is starting to see a resurgence of interest because you can't strip out that middleman charge or that margin on that purchase from the manufacturer to middleman to the U.S. importer. So those are some ideas and thoughts I'll offer up on managing customs values.
I appreciate that. Go ahead.
Sorry, can I just add to that, Mark? Also, I'm in the world of transfer pricing, right? So I typically will deal with related parties.
Yeah.
So also seeing in that declaration, that customs value is the noise of transfer pricing that wasn't done, right?
Yeah.
Transactionally. So this is a really interesting time, especially US, Mexico, Canada. Nobody was concerned about having one intercompany transaction and calling it a product flow, right? A product price. And now it's, wait a minute, you had some strategic leadership services, you had G&A services, maybe there, so we're taking out these things very organically from, that just aren't related to the product price. So there's definitely opportunity there too.
Yeah.
Marina, from a financial planning lens, as I put those glasses on, how should LA businesses be adjusting their tax strategies specifically to manage tariff impacts? What does that look like today? What do we know?
Yeah, so really good question, right? So there's talk about some of these tariffs related to wanting to bring manufacturing back home, to the US, right? That is not as realistic as, just saying the words, right? There's only a certain category of people. It involves time and funding, and, you have to have a certain amount there. So we need to look at other opportunities and other things. What I mentioned earlier about possibly setting up a distribution network and tweaking that supply chain a little bit. I think it's really important. I think companies need to realize, and I don't think the administration is quite processing this yet, or, the impact. So we're probably not going to get guidance for a while. But as you're increasing the customs piece of it and the tariffs, which are a tax, you're naturally going to lower profitability for that company. The importer of record is typically a distributor, let's say in the US market, not always, but typically, right? And they will tend to have thinner margins because they're buying a product and selling a product, right? It's not a complicated business. So now, if they can't diffuse that tariff, right? If they can't renegotiate a supply chain with a contract with the vendor, if they can't pass along to the consumer, which many can't, now you're in this sort of outside the range profitability position, right? And now you've got the IRS looking at you saying, well, wait a minute, you're not in the range, and we're going to make a transfer pricing adjustment. So you're in the arm's length range, which then what? Creates a double taxation issue. You have the other market, trying to say like they should be funding up that US entity, but, why should they do that? They're already, damaged or impacted by the US driven tariffs. So it's a complicated discussion. And I think Mark said it earlier, like this is very bespoke, right? So we're giving some general high level advice here, but it's really specific to every company.
Yeah, and Marina, you kind of answered a little of the next question I was going to ask, which really involved, profit margins. I'm looking at things aside from tax planning. How are rising costs impacting? So you mentioned profit margins, of course, but also cash flow and budgeting. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think everyone can think about the last time we had a bit of a crisis, right? And it wasn't that far away with COVID, where suddenly, it needs to understand where the cash is and why it's located in markets that it can't get out of quickly, right? And how do we get it to where it needs to be? So I think that, these are the types of things. Like, it's the time to look, regardless of what happens to tariffs and the exact number. It's a good time for companies to look at all costs, operating costs, and what can be trimmed a little bit. Look at where their cash might be stuck because they just don't have a good transfer pricing and global tax, strategy, and just seeing, what can happen, and also the communication internally between tax and the supply chain, the product people. I mean, I'm seeing that increase a lot, and that's just can't be bad, right? A lot of times, you ask the question to the financial people of who's the importer of record, and they don't know because they're not focused there. Now they're focused. There's a focus between the two groups, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've also heard terms being thrown around. One in particular that comes to mind is tariff engineering. Mark, can you share with our readers who maybe are not familiar with this term what it is, and maybe how reclassifying products can actually help lower costs?
Yeah. Well, let's start off by saying if you reclassify, best not to try to reclassify for the specific purpose of trying to avoid tariffs. Reclassify because it's not as precise as it should be, and or you've identified that there has been an error for some time and you're going to correct it. So reclassify for compliance. Doesn't mean you shouldn't also have the knock-on potential benefit of a lower tariff rate applicable, but there's reasons to classify. Classification, tariff/tariff engineering, it's built around the harmonized tariff schedule of the United States, which itself is built around the harmonized system that is an agreement among all the countries that are members of the World Trade Organization to classify goods under a common standard nomenclature using a system. We hear about SIS codes, NCIS codes, all these different types of other codes. This is another coding system. That's important because the tariff code, the tariff classification code, upon which tariff engineering can be done, is dependent upon a certain set of rules that are articulated in the harmonized tariff schedule of the U.S. Reading and interpreting those rules and applying those rules can help you get to the right classification of a good. In other words, you could have perhaps a tablet. We all have tablets in our lives, right? But there's different ways tablets are structured. There's different use of tablet type technology. If you have a tablet on an exercise bike, the question is it a tablet or is it part of the exercise bike, right? So thinking about how you've determined the classification of an item like a tablet and what it contains, different inputs, etc., electronic inputs, certain types of capabilities, functionalities, dimensions, material composition, etc., determine the tariff code. And that tariff code drives the tariff rate around which these tariffs apply. So getting that correct, if you can find a code that works and is defensible and you can articulate such upon questioning from the authority, because it probably will come at some point, that this code is the right one versus another code. And this code that we're using, we pay a 10% tariff versus the other code where we pay a 30% tariff, can mean all the difference between being able to have a viable, profitable product that's imported and not. So tariff engineering is important. It's very technical and very detailed. So you don't want to embark on that on your own. You definitely want to engage with a professional who is experienced in it, because there's a lot of nuance and a lot of easy misunderstandings. The language in the tariff schedule is not straightforward in many respects. For example, and I'll finish off with this thought, computers. The word computer doesn't really exist in the tariff schedule, is a line item. They're called automatic data processing machines. So you try to search up the word computer in a tariff search in the tariff schedule, you're not going to find it. You have to be searching for automatic data processing machines. You may see references to computers in rulings and other types of guidance around classification of an automatic data processing machine, but they're still called that in the tariff schedule formally.
Thank you so much, Mark. This has been such an informative conversation thus far, and we've gotten a lot of really great information to share for our readers. We've got a lot of great questions left, so I'm going to ask that we condense our responses just a little bit so that we can try to get through as many of these questions for our audience as possible. I want to move to finance and talk about operations and supply chain. Marina, you sort of alluded to this earlier where you said, hey, more communication is only a good thing. So a question I have for you, Marina, would be, how are businesses adapting their sourcing and their logistics strategies in order to reduce tariff exposure? Are there any standout approaches that you've seen?
Yeah, again, it's so dependent on not just industry, not just company, but product and where they sit in that supply chain. What is their negotiating power, right? Walmart, Costco, Amazon's going to fare a lot better than your mom and pop, distributor, right? That doesn't, one, may not sell the variety of product, and two, doesn't have that, bargaining power to say, hey, we just want our products stocked up and, we want it at the same price, right? So there's a lot of tension there, around that and understanding like where you sit in that scenario, I think is really critical. And yeah, nearshoring definitely under consideration. And some of my clients have been trying to do that since COVID. Note the trying, right? There's a lot of increased costs, labor costs, just the US is an expensive place, right? So it's just not that easy to do, and not everyone can do that. Some diversifying of the supply chain, but guess what? Companies are looking for US made products, and then they're digging deeper and realizing all the raw materials are coming from China or, elsewhere anyhow. So it's just not as easy as it would be, to do that. Now, circumventing, if it makes sense, I think I want to play on something Mark said or alluded to earlier. You don't drop the customs price for a tariff. Like that it's tax, and that's not the justification for dropping the price. Just the same way you don't drop a transfer price for tax-driven reasons. You need the economic substance behind it. That's why it's a strategy, not a knee-jerk reaction, right? And the two go hand in hand, kind of peanut butter and jelly-ish, right? There's definitely that relationship that needs to be discussed together.
Yeah, and companies are also having to learn about things that maybe they haven't had to know as much about, such
Right.
as fines for lack of compliance procedures. Mark, on that note, for those who are navigating this, on a day-to-day basis, how can companies best avoid penalties and costly fines?
Well, I would say first and foremost, make sure you've empowered somebody within your own business to learn and to be exposed to and get some credentialing around this area first.
Yeah.
There's a lot here, right? Because this area of tariffs, if you think about it, doesn't sit neatly in any particular part of a business. It sits in the intersection of finance, operations / supply chain / logistics / transportation, connectivity to tax and the tax department to the extent company has a tax department, and legal, right? So there's at least 4+ areas in any company where these things tend to fall, and not one person necessarily always owns it. And it's usually a hodgepodge of engagement with outside vendors as well. So there's freight carriers who may or may not also offer customs brokerage services. So the company understanding how its supply chain structure is, who are the partners in that supply chain, who's running what number of brokers the company's engaging, and what visibility and metrics are around this is important. Control environment, which includes procedures, escalation procedures, product flow, etc., receiving, quantity counts, all those things matter. So it's a complex, dynamic area, but the starting point really is knowing what you're doing and assessing whether it's fit for purpose in today's new environment.
Yeah, and as advisors, you both have both internal and external stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
Mark, I'm going to stick with you for a moment here. Are there any best practices that you put in place or that you've worked on over the years that really helps you communicate specific tariff impacts with both sets of stakeholders?
Yes. One is, again, getting back to the empowerment. Data is your friend here, right? Because every filing that you make upon which your owed tariff is calculated, it's very much akin to filing your own personal taxes, right? If you think about it that way. You can engage an expert to help you prepare your taxes, but at the end of the day, you're the signatory. You're the one who will pay the tax that's owed. Same thing in the customs and trade space. However, in that space, that most companies delegate that out to a customs broker that operates with a power of attorney. So they lose visibility to their own information, to their own data, right? So those brokers are acting under that authority as a proxy for the business. So, and the number of transactions are usually very high. So it's not like once a year an income tax return. This is daily activity that are goods that are being ordered and received and moved. So that amount of information, those 40 some elements of data that are filed on every import, times dozens of imports that may be made every week, add up. So your data is your friend. So embrace data and work with systems that allow you to have that visibility. The granular is where the opportunities lie. So get to the granular within the data, figure out what your trends look like, figure out what your anomalies are, find out who's creating the data that's getting filed.
Right.
That's a starting point.
Thank you. Embrace data. We'll certainly take that away. I want to go back to something and dive a little bit deeper, something that we covered at a high level earlier in the conversation. When we see tariffs imposed, we know that they ultimately impact the cost of the goods and they impact the consumers. Businesses are left with a challenging decision to make. They can either absorb all or part of those costs in order to placate their customers, or they can pass it on or a portion of it on to the customers in order to stay competitive. But that also comes at a cost. Marina, how are you advising your clients on this? Are they rethinking price strategies altogether? What do you tell them?
Yeah, it's having a conversation again with the product people and the tax finance people and talking through where they are and the level of detail that they need to know now about their own vendors. By the way, whether it's a third party or a related party, they need to understand the supply chain of their vendors. Whereas in the past, who cared, right? It wasn't something of interest. And now it's like, okay, is it really a Canadian product I'm buying, or did it originate in China? And now I'm going to get saddled with, additional costs as well, right? Because my vendor's costs went up. So yeah, looking at all of that. And again, what can be removed from really just identifying that product price itself. So what's in there? What's the noise? Let's figure out what it is and quantify it and methodically, build a case for making sure that you're only reflecting the product price. Mark, I'm sure your opinion, and you've seen this, right? Like I have clients that, products cross-border daily, maybe they're perishable goods and they have daily transactions. Like any decrease in price is going to get noticed and is going to get flagged, right? So you need to be ready for that. Expect an audit. expect an audit, and you need a reason to lower the price. And that's what I want to make sure people understand, because my first question on almost every call is, what if I just lower my price? What if I just lower my customs duty? Right?
Yeah.
So
Well, Mark, I want to circle back on trade policy. Are free trade agreements such as the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, are these still helpful tools for reducing tariff exposure, or has that just completely gone out the window at this point?
Mhm. Um, USMCA is our largest and most robust and dynamic of all the trade agreements the U.S. has. It is still very much a valuable avenue for companies that have already set themselves up for success under it. Um, what is fascinating is we've learned that there's actually a large percentage, I don't know exactly what it is, but it's somewhere around the 40-50% of all goods that are imported from Canada and Mexico into the US do not qualify for USMCA. So the question I have is, what have these companies been doing all this time? Why would they do anything other, right? There's all kinds of ways you can qualify. It's not as it's there. There are some requirements that you have to adhere to and verify. But if you put in the time, it can be a big saving. And maybe it's that the tariff rates, the normal tariff rates, the most favored nation rates charged by any of these countries, and the U.S. being included in that, leverage average low single digits for so long that they said, oh, well, it's not worth the squeeze to try to get that 2 or 3% removed by all this vendor compliance and all these questions about what are those vendors doing to the product to make it Mexican, to make it Canadian, to allow us to claim a tariff-free entry into the US. Different game now. Because you're either in or you're paying a 25% tariff on Canada, Mexico sourced items is one example. There's a lot of other trade agreements that are out there. But if you can get yourself qualified for an agreement like the USMCA, which two of our largest trading partners, along with China, where there's no agreement, take advantage of it, because it can be the difference between staying in business and being a viable going concern and not. We are seeing that there is tremendous downward pressure on margins and profitabilities. It's the same thing that Marina had mentioned before. Customs is now increasingly active, probing around the edges. What's going on in your business? How come you have a different tariff code today than you just used last year, or maybe a few months ago? Or how come your prices suddenly are lower? So they're noticing, right? The agency, the Customs and Border Protection, like most government agencies, is a big data collection organization. So they're looking at the data and they're pulling out flags and they're starting to follow up. So there's going to be a slew of activity, I expect, in the coming years around all this rush of activity around tariff planning. So a lot of it's legit, but a lot of it probably also has some less than, I guess, strong foundations in terms of exploring tactics and strategies to lower the tariff impact.
Okay, so this has been a great conversation, and we could probably do this for another couple hours and still have an awful lot to talk about.
Yeah,
and then add things tomorrow that are new to the conversation based on new things that we see. We're down to final two questions. Marina, first with you. As we're looking toward the future, okay, are shifting global trade dynamics opening the door for nearshoring? You mentioned that a little bit, that we saw that during COVID, but talk about it now. Do you see that as a new shift, something that's going to be more focused, and what could that potentially mean for LA-based businesses?
I think people are looking into it, right? I definitely have clients that are looking into it and trying to do so. I think more during COVID, honestly, than now, and only because of the uncertainty, right? We don't know where this is going to land. So nearshoring is a changing your manufacturing and your supply chain is a very expensive and long-term decision, and it's not done lightly. So people are at least going to try to get through this 90-day pause, see if things ramp up with the retaliatory tariffs, right, before they're making big decisions like that. And then when they look at the ROIs, right, it's hard to compete at that level. So what's the difference? An increased product price because of increased tariffs, or an increased product price because you can't manage to manufacture that product in the US in a competitive way, right? And I'm not saying that's for every product. I think there are classes of businesses that can bring manufacturing back to the US and it'll go very well, right? I just don't think it's realistic for everybody to be thinking that. I think what we said before, right? This is not, I mean, just times of challenges are also times where you can focus on what you can do instead of what you can't do, right? So look in, explore, learn. As Mark said, this is a big learning opportunity, and now it matters. So maybe people weren't looking. I can't believe that statistic you threw out, that 40 to 50%, right? I can't believe it's crazy, right? And why? Because it just didn't matter then. Now it matters. They need to look. I have a company that approached me for like digital solutions because they said, okay, our process is very manual, involving papers and humans, right? And now the margin of error is so great, right? Get a small error could cost millions,
Yes.
In the customs declaration. So it's the time to look at your whole business and see, where the improvements can come into play.
I think that that's a perfect way to sort of close things out, because there's a strong connection with your last comments to my last question, because there are opportunities here. So I'm gonna close out with a final question for each of you to respond to. And again, it's looking ahead. What is one key shift or opportunity that Los Angeles area businesses should be preparing for as we see global trade continue to evolve? Mark, let's start with you.
Well, although I have a personal interest in this because I'm an advisor in this space, explore bonded operations in the short, medium terms, because the volatility of the tariff releases, the announcements, the aggressive position of the new trade policy from the administration, bonded warehouses are tremendously flexible. The problem is you're starting to see decreasing space availability in existing bonded locations. However, it doesn't mean you as a business, if you have the capital to do so, shouldn't consider maybe bonding part or all of your existing distribution center or your warehouse space. Explore that. It is a very good program. It's a very transparent program. Does require engagement with U.S. Customs. However, the stand-up time could be somewhere between 3 to 6 months, and you could have it. That might be good enough time for the environment we're entering. We're going to be in a high tariff rate environment, I think, for at least the next 4 years, and then perhaps an adjustment period after that in whatever the next administration plans to do. But right now, in this environment, I think bonded is one of the proper ways to be exploring tariff mitigation, reduction, deferral, or exemption.
Mark, thank you so much. Marina, final thoughts.
Okay. We know that doing nothing is not a good idea, right? And we know that doing something extreme, like just lowering or knee-jerk reaction, lowering a customs price, especially away from a transfer price as they're, interlinked, is not a good idea either. So again, it's about the education and exploring what you can do, which is do the research, learn, talk to your customs and transfer pricing advisors, right? Understand what your levers are, right? Model the financials. We do that all the time. We've got a tool. We just figure out, hey, if you, try to get back this much from the customer, this much for the vendor, if this happens versus that happens, if we can take out these assists and focus on this product price versus the more inflated price that you have, here's the benefit, right? And we're just looking at how do we build a more resilient global company, right? That then in the future, one is to solve what's happening now, but in the future to be set up for it to not happen again. Like people should have learned lessons about their supply agreements and their vendor agreements, right? Maybe they need to talk to their attorneys about getting in language around this type of thing, right? So they do maybe have some recourse, in the end. Yeah, it's just, understanding sort of your global structure and are you efficient to begin with, or can we make some tweaks to put you in a better position?
And I think that's really what this is about, is finding ways to keep businesses in the best position possible. Marina, Mark, I want to thank you so much for being a part of this today. Personally, I know that I'm walking away more informed with a lot of takeaways, and it's clear that understanding and navigating tariffs has become not just a tactical issue, but a strategic imperative for businesses here in Los Angeles and beyond. As I think about everything we've covered, we've heard powerful insights, managing costs, protecting profit margins, to building more resilient and even globally competitive operations. One thing that we know is that the global landscape is going to continue to evolve. It will evolve, it will change, and we have to adapt. But with the right strategies in place, businesses here in Los Angeles, they can turn those challenges into opportunities for growth and leadership internally. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. We at the Business Journal, we truly strive to serve our region with the most important business news and resources possible. And I think today's discussion is a great example of how we do that. I want to thank our guests for being a part of this. Stay informed, stay adaptable, and we look forward to hosting you again soon.